After the chaos and rapid change of the Progressive Era and World War I, a lot of Americans were like, okay, we're tired. We let women vote, that was cute, we're fine with that, but now let's all calm down and just get back to business. Throughout the 1920s, a series of Republican presidents were elected, starting with Warren Harding, who campaigned on the idea of a return to normalcy. His campaign slogan actually was, America First. Now, in this context, it makes sense. For almost all of American history, the country has been isolationist, focused on ourselves. Sure, we got involved in Latin America, but that's different. That was just us Monroe doctrining, right? Typically, we stayed above the fray in European affairs, selectively following George's advice. Wilson had to kind of get dragged into World War I, and most of the country agreed that we should just go back to focusing on ourselves and the economy and move away from more global affairs. And this idea was also supported by conservatives who were bristling under all the change of the Progressive Era. And we're going to see this trend throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, a period of liberal reforms followed by a rise of conservatism. I see you, Nixon, silent majority. And really, it was easy for Republican presidents to say, let's just focus on the economy, because the economy was like straight up crushing it. We entered World War I as a debtor nation, but by the end of the conflict, the Allies owed us $10 million. Sweet. By the 1920s, we were the dominant economic power in the Western world, and we used that newfound influence to try to bring the rest of the world to our viewpoint of war is bad, business is good. Throughout the 20s, we signed a series of international agreements meant to prevent military buildup and avoid future conflicts. Specifically, in the Kellogg-Briand Pact, 15 nations signed a treaty agreeing to abandon war altogether and settle disputes peacefully. Oh, look at how sweet and naive we were in 1928. What a difference a year makes. So we were isolationist-ish. Our biggest focus was getting the Western economies back up and running, and we did that by funding most of Germany's war debts. Remember from your world history class how the Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to pay so much in war reparations that they basically just invited Hitler to come take them over? No? Just me? Well, the US stepped in to try to prevent all of that from happening. American banks lent money to Germany so that they could pay back Britain and France, who in turn could start buying our stuff again. It was a perfect plan. That is, unless American banks somehow suddenly failed overnight. Anyway, Harding's Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, built a new economic policy that would kind of become the foundation for modern Republican policy. It boiled down to 3 goals: balance the budget, reduce government debt, and cut taxes. This last part is crucial and controversial, and it's now known as supply-side economics. Basically, the idea is that if taxes are lower, businesses will have more money to invest in expansion and new jobs, and consumers will have more money to buy stuff. We're going to come back to this in a few episodes. Don't worry, Reagan, we're getting to you. But by 1928, income tax for most Americans was between 1% and 5%. And it had dropped for the richest Americans from 73% to 25%. And what were people doing with those fat wallets? They were buying stuff. On the surface, the national economy was booming. Per capita earnings grew 22% over the decade as work hours decreased. People had a growing disposable income that they built on new mass-produced goods. Most famously, Henry Ford lowered the cost of his Model T so that the car became a common purchase instead of a luxury item reserved for the rich. In fact, in 1925, about 80% of families who owned a car didn't have bathtubs with running water. American innovation was also booming. Just 20 years after the Wright brothers first took flight, the Postal Service was carrying mail via planes, and Congress was investing federal money to build airports all over the country. In 1927, American Charles Lindbergh completed the first transatlantic solo flight. The radio industry grew and connected Americans culturally more than ever before. In 1920, one of the first public radio broadcasts ever announced the news of Harding's presidential victory. By 1929, there were over 12 million radios in use in the US, and companies like NBC and CBS had stations broadcasting all over the country. But even though the 1920s are dominated by economics, they weren't without political scandal either. During Harding's presidency, many of his cabinet members became embroiled in many scandals, made worse by the fact that many of them were Harding's personal friends and allies from his state politics days, the Ohio Gang. I'm sorry, but that's like the least intimidating gang name of all time. For example, the first ever head of Veterans Affairs, the VA, was caught selling medical supplies meant for vet hospitals and keeping the money for himself. He literally stole from veterans hospitals after a world war. But the most infamous political scandal in American history up to this point was the politely named Teapot Dome Scandal. In 1922, Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall leased federal land that was supposed to be for U.S. Navy oil reserves to private companies in exchange for bribes. The Wall Street Journal broke the story, and the Senate investigation lasted throughout the decade. In 1929, Secretary Fall became the first cabinet secretary ever to go to prison. Now, Harding died near the end of his first term, and American outrage over the scandals was kind of quelled by the dull, soothing nothingness that was Calvin Coolidge. And now an ode to Calvin Coolidge. Oh, silent Cal, your biographer said that you represented the genius of the average, which makes no sense and is also the most backhanded burn of all time. Your Wikipedia page literally says that as vice president, you, quote, gave a number of unremarkable speeches around the country, with citations. What a weird president you were. You buzzed in your staff to the Oval Office, then hid behind the curtains while they looked for you. You won the presidency outright in 1924 by saying that the business of America is business, which, if true, is going to make America look pretty dumb in a few years. You are the epitome of a laissez-faire president, and you got out just in time to let Herbert Hoover take the fall. Well played, sir. So I know that the real thing everyone cares about when we talk about the Roaring Twenties is the parties, sequins, cocktails, that Leonardo DiCaprio gif. And in a lot of ways, it's right. The 1920s were about a feeling. Young people had moved to the cities, everyone had cars and thus more freedom. We had just fought a brutal war that no one really cared about, and now the government was telling us we couldn't drink alcohol? Yeah, right. The epitome of this new freedom was the flapper. These female party animals were the culmination of a lot of historical developments over the past few decades. Women getting out into the workplace during World War I and having their own spending money, plus a political voice through suffrage, plus more control over their body thanks to Margaret Sanger's work on birth control. Flappers are mostly identified through their clothing, dresses that show off their calves, no corsets, a short bob haircut, and bright lipstick. Designers like Coco Chanel were at the forefront of modern fashion, especially with sportswear like tennis dresses that gave women freedom and a relaxed silhouette. Basically, tennis dresses were to the 1920s what yoga pants are to the 2020s. You get it. Okay, so remember the progressive era? Women got the right to vote. Teddy was a feminist. We tried to get kids out of factories, but the Supreme Court was like, nah. So remember that there were a few groups that got left out of all of that progress. New immigrants and Black Americans. And both of those groups began to take matters into their own hands in the 1920s. Now, I don't want to give the impression that all new immigrants became bootleggers, because we already have enough of an unfounded complex in this country about immigration and crime. But it is true that people who didn't have opportunities in the legitimate economy found new ways to rise up the socioeconomic ladder during Prohibition. During the Civil War, soldiers would sneak liquor into camp in their boots, aka bootleggers. But after the 18th Amendment, during Prohibition, bootlegging became an entire industry. Sneaking in alcohol from Canada or overseas, or illegally brewing alcohol, an entire economy grew around the illicit industry, and this new economy was run by gangs. Most famously, Al Capone became head of the Chicago mafia, using violence and intimidation to drive out his rivals. This era reached its climax in 1929 with the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, when 7 members of a rival mob run by Bugs Moran were machine-gunned by Capone's men dressed as police. Now, there's already so much good media out there dedicated to the 1920s mafia, so I'll leave the details to them. But I do want us to understand these gangs in the context of American history. Basically, these were groups who were not allowed to become part of the legitimate economy. Many places refused to hire immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, including Italy, and it was difficult for many men to find a way to make money. Way oversimplified, but discrimination and prohibition drove a lot of these communities into the black market. And I'm not saying that that means they shouldn't be held responsible for crimes committed, but it's important to understand that the US has a history of turning the people that we dislike or expect to be criminals into the very thing we feared. Another important element of the 1920s cultural explosion is the Harlem Renaissance, Black culture's golden age in the 1920s. Throughout the last decade or so, hundreds of thousands of Black Americans had been moving from the South up to the cities to fill jobs in growing factories, especially during World War I. By the end of the Great Migration, over 300,000 African Americans had left the South and ended up in cities like LA, Detroit, Chicago, and New York. The Harlem neighborhood of New York became a global mecca for Black artists, writers, and activists in the 1920s, partly thanks to the work of our guy W.E.B. Du Bois. Using his influence in the newly founded NAACP, he and his peers created outlets for Black people to show what they could do in spaces like the NAACP magazine, The Crisis. Now, I could name hundreds of Black creators who thrived during this time, but a few highlights include female novelist Jessie Redmond Fawcett's 1924 novel, There Is Confusion. In this, she explored the issue of Black Americans finding their own identity in mostly white Manhattan. And she went on to work with Du Bois to found a magazine for Black children to read stories and see photos of their own experience. At the debut party for Fawcett's book, other Black organizers used the event to connect Black creators with white publishing elites. And out of that party, many Black writers began getting published in mainstream magazines like Harper's, including Langston Hughes. Now, Hughes is the poster child for the Harlem Renaissance. His poems have become the voice of the movement to find pride in Blackness and to celebrate the contributions of Black people to American culture, which is really one of the main goals of the Harlem Renaissance. I highly recommend you pause to go read his poem, I, Too. In addition to writers, actors like Paul Robeson gained mainstream fame. Although he had a law degree, there were few opportunities for Black lawyers, and so he became an actor instead, famously starring as Othello in London's West End. In 1921, Shuffle Along debuted on Broadway, bringing Harlem musical reviews to a white audience. In fine art, one of my faves, Aaron Douglas, adapted African art styles to paint the Black American experience, earning him the title the father of Black American art. His murals are some of my favorite works of American art of all time, like this one that shows the Black experience from enslavement in Africa through emancipation, Reconstruction, and then the rise of the Jim Crow South. But possibly the most well-known contribution from Black culture is music. In many ways, jazz and the blues are the culmination of the Black experience in the United States. I mean, many of the instruments, like the banjo and drums, are distinctly African, then mixed with European-style big band sounds. Artists like Louis Armstrong, Fats Waller, and Duke Ellington played and composed music for big bands full of Black musicians. Singers like Bessie Smith brought the blues into mainstream American music. Bessie Smith, also known as the Empress of the Blues, was famous around the world, but she died in the 1930s in a car accident. But actually, she didn't die in the car accident. She died because the first ambulance to arrive at the scene was from the White Hospital, and they refused to take her. This is a really important reminder that although Black artists are becoming recognized and respected for their talents around the country, racism is still alive and well. Now, of course, there was also division and controversy within the Harlem Renaissance. For one, there were generational divides between older activists like Du Bois and younger, more radical people within the movement. Zora Neale Hurston's literary magazine Fire discussed issues that were taboo across most of society, including homosexuality. And then there were some Black Americans who felt like Black artists were selling out and turning their culture into a commodity to be consumed by white audiences. While there were plenty of nightclubs in Harlem for Black people to enjoy their own music, the most successful clubs were those that catered to white New Yorkers. The most famous was the Cotton Club. Get it? Cotton, like slaves, and also cotton is white? Yeah, clever. The audience at the Cotton Club was entirely white, but the talent on stage was often the most respected Black musicians of the day, most notably Duke Ellington. And the real question was whether this was selling out or a sign that Black culture, and thus Black people, were slowly becoming more accepted by general society, at least in highly urban New York. And there were divisions across the United States, not just within the Black community. In fact, the 1920s is in many ways characterized by a massive cultural divide that had grown over the past few decades. 1920 was the first year in American history when more Americans lived in cities than in rural areas. And by this point, the US economy was industrialized, but that technology and progress hadn't reached as many parts of the country. Often those living in small towns and rural areas were still essentially in the 19th century, and they often felt isolated and confused by the new growth and chaos of the cities. Many men marveled or were horrified by new liberated women. A famous comic strip showed common conversations between older people talking about the good old days of tradition and propriety, and it always ended with, "Them days are gone forever." It's essentially the OK Boomer of the 1920s. With cars, birth control, shorter skirts, speakeasies, and all-night dance parties, the group that often felt the most left behind was evangelical Christians. And this came to a head in the famous Scopes trial of 1925. As famous lawyers debated back and forth over the merits of teaching evolution in science classrooms, Americans tuned in, often on their new radios, to hear what was essentially a conversation between kind of traditional Puritan America and modern progressivism. Clarence Darrow argued for the progressives against William Jennings Bryan, who represented the evangelicals. Now, the issue on trial was actually pretty simple. A high school biology teacher, John T. Scopes, taught evolution in his classroom, even though a Tennessee law declared that illegal. But that wasn't really the debate. I mean, he clearly broke the law, but that was the point, right? Progressives wanted to shine a light on evangelical influence in politics, while evangelical Christians held on as they felt like so much of what they knew was being discarded in favor of modernity. In the end, the evangelicals won the battle but lost the war. Scopes was found guilty and fined, but his punishment was eventually thrown out. But the spectacle of the trial was politically really embarrassing for evangelical Christians who would stay out of politics for about 50 years. Clarence Darrow kind of eviscerated William Jennings Bryan and his views on evangelical Christianity and how it should be interpreted literally as American policy. So the 1920s is a great example of a chaotic decade full of contradictions that has been glossed over because the economy was booming and the parties were fun. But remember that most people didn't get to party it up like Gatsby. Sure, jazz and blues is playing on the radio, but the KKK is also surging in popularity. And yeah, technology is making life in the cities easier than ever, but farmers in rural communities are increasingly feeling left behind. Not to mention all those World War I veterans suffering from undiagnosed PTSD. And Europe is getting rebuilt, but only thanks to a constant infusion of cash from American banks that are basically printing money. Sure, this will end well. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe and join patreon.com/antisocialstudies.